Are you stuck in the same old routine at work? Do you find yourself hitting a creative wall, unable to see beyond your current perspective? It's time to break free and unlock the power of fresh perspectives. Hello, David Gouthro, and today I have as my guest Dan Olivieri. And I usually have to mispronounce things 5 or 6 times before I get it, Dan. So I'll just refer to you as Dan for now.
Sounds
And
great.
it's great to see you here today. We connected many, many years ago, but maybe you could just say what you're focusing on now and how you came to that. What some of your background is to talk about what we're going to explore today.
Sure. Sounds good. What I'm really focusing on right now is trying to address the fact that in each community, there's these large, challenging issues that are happening at a social level. And there needs to be a voice and an entity that brings the right people to the table to address it in a novel, a really different way of thinking about it, and trying to set ego aside and just focusing on the issues themselves and honoring the complexity of the challenge while still trying to drive at fairly simplistic solutions.
So quick level set. What are some examples of some of those kinds of issues so people know what context to listen into for this?
Of course. So, housing is a big conversation right now, affordability in general. It goes beyond that. And we can even look at things like, so there's the ramification of the affordability crisis, which is those who are experiencing homelessness.
Mhm.
And how do they access resources? And then the challenges that individuals face in the inequity in service delivery. So not being able to even get the things that you need to be able to survive when you're of a particular, social or demographic background that is, systemically repressed. So that's a really complex way of saying it, but really it's people just can't get what they need. And sometimes we have to rethink how we're trying to support them because there's a lot of people trying to do good, but we're not doing it well enough together.
Well, and I think a lot of times what I've seen is that those who are better off do things for other people rather than with other people. So you develop all these great plans and processes that it turns out people don't want. So how did you come to
Yeah.
be doing this, Dan? Give us a little bit of insight into your background.
For sure. So over the past 17 years, what I've done is really focused on performance and effectiveness. So I looked at it from the perspective of human and individual performance in the lens of sport. And then that evolved to looking at human performance in business through human resources and people services and functions, and then trying to broaden that to look at how do we operate as an organization as effectively as possible. So now taking that human level, elevating it to the systemic level or the organizational level. And I was doing that within the local government sector.
Mhm.
After doing that work for about 17 years and feeling like I accomplished a lot and learned a lot, I realized that I wanted to try to challenge myself in a different kind of way. And so I've actually gone on out on my own as a freelance consultant to support municipalities and nonprofits to solve the challenges that their missions are tasking them to address.
So you mentioned a couple of things in an opening comment about getting the right people at the table. So I guess the two big questions that I have are, how do you decide who the right people are? That's one question. Then another question that's just more of a tactical question is how do you get them to the table? So maybe we can start with the first one and maybe take one example like housing. So who are the right people to be there? Then we can talk about how to get them to the table.
Sure. So if we want to talk about housing specifically, the province obviously has a role to play. Municipalities have a role to play. Nonprofits, social enterprises, municipalities. There's a lot of players at the table, and when you try to tackle an issue as big as housing affordability at the provincial level, it's easy to get bogged down in the complexity of the ecosystem. And I'm going to break down what an ecosystem is for just a minute. Really, it's all of the component parts around a service or around a function that contribute to making it happen. So we have so many different we call them interest holders or stakeholders is kind of the historic language. They're the individuals that have a say and an impact on what you're trying to accomplish. And so the important part is to think who's actually playing a role and talking to those who you already know, and you'll eventually get all the names and you'll understand who exists in that system at a community level. So just starting at a more foundational standpoint, because so much of what we do and what we experience exists in our communities. It doesn't really exist at a provincial or even a federal level. We still look close to home. So the first part is just having those conversations. If you're trying to affect change in a system, just talking to the people who are involved, understanding who they work with and who's not at the table, who's not showing up, because often they're as important as the people who do show up at the table. And then the second part of your question is, how do you get them to the table? You have to just show what's in it for them. And I've encountered this a number of times. Part of my old role was talking about was dealing with grants and applying for grants. The critical component of getting funding from anyone is telling the story of how what you're doing is fulfilling their purpose in as simple a terms as you can. And connecting those dots around the table of interest holders is how you get them to sit at the table, and then showing them progress is how you get them to stay at the table.
So again, a number of questions come up for me, and you rhymed off probably about 8 or 9 stakeholders for
Sure.
housing. And so, it's one thing to identify the categories of people or the clusters, but then it's finding the right people within there. Because sometimes there's an organization that may be invested somehow, but they send someone junior or someone who doesn't have the ability to make decisions or doesn't have a broad enough perspective. So I want to dig a little deeper into how do you get the right people. I totally get that they're in the community and that's where we should start
Oh
because
yeah.
those are the ones who are affected. But maybe you could give some suggestions of how, if there's a particular project that you were involved in and how you went about getting the right people to the table, just so folks can
So
picture the complexity of it, but also the importance of what you do.
And one project that really stands out to me is back during COVID, we were one of the projects I was working on was actually funded by the province to provide services to unsheltered people. Um, and what we ended up doing, and this wasn't my idea, I was just on the implementation side, making it happen, was we wanted to bring all of the services in our community that support unsheltered people under a single umbrella. And literally, it was a tent where the Ministry of Social Development, it was Ministry of Children, Family Services and Development. All of those provincial entities had a representative at that tent, and then we also had volunteers serving food. All those pieces. We had to make a human connection, and so we actually found that speaking with the immediate person who is going to show up and building a relationship, and then finding an opportunity to make a human connection with the actual decision maker
Mhm.
was the right approach. So whether it was finding a meeting that they were going to be at, um, or even just a telephone conversation, just finding any opportunity to have 5 minutes to have a human connection made all the difference in whether they were going to be engaged to hear what we were trying to do or dismiss our request, because ultimately we were asking for something. But until you humanize the request, it's hard to get someone's attention, especially with the demands that are on public servants these days.
So how, again, maybe going down wormholes or rabbit holes,
Yeah.
whatever kind of holes you want to go down here, but how I'm curious how you handle things like let's take the downtown east side here in Vancouver, where there's a number of different organizations that are basically serving the same population. And how do you get them to come together to talk when there's quite often this fear that if we work together, it's going to be, fewer jobs for us, whatever's going to have to be. So people come at that conversation from what they stand to lose rather than the benefit they're going to provide to those folks that they serve. So are there any ways on how you get around that?
And there's a couple different pieces to answering that question. So, for the most part, many of these agencies sit at roundtables where the intent is for them to collaborate and come together as it is.
Mhm.
So, you can get them in the same room.
Mhm.
That's the easy part for the most part.
Mhm.
The hard part is exactly what you've identified, creating a space where we can remove the friction and the competition to be able to realign all their services so that they're working effectively. So the how is it's a toolkit that has been developed by a professor down in the States, Rob Brodnick. It's called the Ecosystem Project Toolkit. And what it does is it's a series of facilitated sessions or conversations where you actually start putting all of the agencies on a map and you start seeing the relationships between them and how they help and hurt each other to some degree. What are the pain points? What are the challenges? And you identify where there's commonality between them. And then it's the hard conversation of we're both competing in this one sector, but there's this open space that here's the opportunity. Which one of us is best positioned to take advantage of the opportunity and reposition ourselves and allow someone else to take the space we previously occupied? So it's not an easy conversation. It's not one conversation. It's a continued dialogue of showing the opportunity and the benefit, and then relating it back to their board, how their board sees the vision for the organization, all the kind of that complexity.
Like, I would imagine that trust is a pretty huge component of all of this, and I can see that at a couple of different levels because there's a trust level between the individuals that represent these different organizations, but then there's also the trust within those organizations. Because I have seen circumstances where well-intentioned people get together and talk about what they're going to do, and then go back to their board or whatever. The board says, "Nope, we're not going to do that." Right? So you don't have alignment within the organization, not nearly as much as between. And it makes me think about the importance of well, the phrase that's often used now in meetings is connection before content. And I think with especially with diverse groups, it's really important. And I was doing some work on Vancouver Island with the town of Ladysmith and the Sminis First Nation, and they had wanted to find some ways that they could work together more effectively. And I believe it was the First Nation that suggests this, that before we start talking about what we could do, let's just get together and get to know each other, which is an investment of time and money and energy, but was so important. Let's figure out who we are and start to build that relationship and trust. And then let's start talking about what we're going to do together. And it seems the more diverse a community is, the more important it is to somehow do that. So, you might, I mean, in just about any community engagement, you may have communities where English is not their first language. And how do they become comfortable enough to participate? Or we talked earlier about homeless people and just a lot of the stigma that they hold amongst themselves and that others hold, and things like that. And how do you get them to the table? So how do you start to build that sort of the trust, the connection before content in some of these big issues that affect so many people in so many different ways?
And it's building a micro community. So just a sense that where you're talking about investing time. So I just need to take a quick step back because what really resonated with me with what you just said is a conversation I had with a leader at Fountain First Nation, who I was pushing. I was driving towards achieving an objective,
Mm.
and it's just not the way that culturally they operate.
Yeah.
And so we had this conversation about the circularity of time. And
Mm.
I was operating under the construct that time is a linear construct. We are moving forward in perpetuity, forever. And I was then grounded to think about time instead as a giant cone where we circle. It takes time. We come back to the issues that we just talked about,
Mm-mm.
but you have to start somewhere and then start revolving around the issue, building circularity, building community, and instead not just moving to the next thing, but continuing the dialogue and the engagement and the commitment. So how does that look when we try to build a community with interest holders? It is time. It's getting them together and being consistent in showing up. So that's what the advantage to in some of these instances, I'm coming in as a third party consultant. I'm engaged with the purpose and the cause. I'm not engaged with an institution.
Right.
So I can be the one who shows up and provides that level of continuity, and I can be the foundation of trust. And that's the part that's really critical when you're trying to move these initiatives forward is having that level of consistency, having a face that when they're there, they're bringing that sense of calm. Uh, so there's that element. And then focusing not just on the activities,
Mm.
but the purpose and the relationships. So fostering strong relationships in whatever manner that looks like. In social work, there's the language of meeting people where they're at. And that exists in a corporate world as much as anything. Everyone is sitting in a different place. And so you need to build your relationship and your trust by identifying what the individual needs are of that interest holder and then meeting them where they are.
I think one of the external forces that can influence these things in a less than positive way is when you have a granting organization that grants certain funding and certain criteria for receiving that fund, and that often the timing that they have is not the natural timing required to build the trust and the relationship that you're doing. You know, I was talking to some funders in the cancer area a number of years ago, and they said, you know, we spend so much time trying to fritz, I think is a technical term, with the research, you know, in order that the grant keeps going, even though the research doesn't go in like a linear fashion. There's stops and
Yeah.
starts and things like that. So there's the blessing of having this funding from whatever the organization is, but then having to play the game of how to keep them happy, that the money is being well spent, even though the way they want it spent, the timing isn't the natural way that things come about. Just as if there's not enough to worry about.
Well, and in the nonprofit world, particularly right now, with the fiscal constraints that the province and federal government are imposing, there's so much uncertainty, and benevolent donations they're evaporating. The level of funding that's just there for community members to donate to ensure that these institutions are able to continue their work, it's dissipating really quickly. So I was working with a nonprofit, and we had a conversation about telling their story because from a nonprofit lens, that is the biggest gap. It is the acknowledgement of the impact that they're having in a community. And it's not talking about what they can do.
Mhm.
It's the story of the person who's benefited. And and that's what actually changes an individual's desire to contribute. And that willingness, it might not be the same amount as it would have been previously, but it's something. And that stabilizes the funding. So when you're going through your grant application process and you have that 3-week gap and you're wondering, do I have to lay off my staff, pause programming? Well, that's now being supported through community donations or corporate donations, others who have a share an interest in the cause.
I think one of the maybe this is more a North American scenario, but you know, with everything that's going on, there's so much evidence that maybe we have to settle for a lower standard of living. And people, the thought of giving something up is really really tough. But you know, a lower standard of living might mean instead of going out to dinner 3 times a week, you go out 1 time a week. Lower standard of living in North America, in most places, doesn't mean suffering. Right, but that's sort of the extreme they go to try to fall back on it, and, oh, it's just this is something earlier today, it was I think one of my colleagues posting something on, you know, what would it be like if all of us, every single one of us, thought of our society as a not-for-profit, and what we were trying to do was to help each other out. You know, and rather than get as much as possible, it's how to do as well as possible, which is quite different from accumulation and things like that. So, sort of a long way from doing that, but you know, to get people to start to think about what little thing can I do that's going to make a difference for someone else, may not solve the whole issue like you talked about, but it's one step closer to something that's going to help them out, and be a little more willing to contribute to others rather than just accumulate for ourselves, like
And
billionaires. How much more mean how much more money do you need to, you know, it's not about need, it's about the game, and that game has so many nasty aspects to it.
it does. And at a community level, I for a long time I was working with a framework called the Community Capital Framework, and it looks at communities from essentially 8 different lenses or 7 different
Mm,
lenses of assets. So you have cultural capital or organizational capital. It's
mm,
also called financial, human. It's all those pieces that make up a community. What are their skills? What buildings and facilities and amenities do they have? And it's actually a framework out of SFU.
oh,
Dr. Mark Rosland created this framework. If you or your listeners have heard of um, donut economics. It's a very complementary model to donut economics, just mostly framed around sustainability, understanding that we can't do everything, but living our best life also means pushing the boundaries of the capabilities of our planet.
So, Dan, I have to stop you for a sec because not
Sure.
everyone listening maybe a foodie. So when you refer to the donut, maybe you could just say a little bit more about that, just so everyone has a common understanding of that term.
Yeah. So the concept of donut economics is essentially that there are boundaries to all of the planetary services, the services the planet provides us.
Mhm.
And there's this gap, and it's the optimal gap where we can meet our needs as a human species without pushing the boundaries of what the planet needs to be sustainable. Those are fairly simplistic terms,
I'm just trying to
but
picture the donut. I'm trying to leave something. I'm
honestly,
feeling
just think of I think of it as a uh, just an inner boundary, so an inner circle, and then
oh,
a
okay.
larger circle. So it just
Oh,
looks like a donut. Yeah.
okay.
But really, fundamentally, all it's saying is that we have to be mindful of how we impact the world and live within limits.
Okay.
Philosophically, that's what we're talking about. Part of donut economics is just the concept that we are stuck in a mindset from a prior, from a very mechanical um, point in time where we were conceptualizing everything as being fundamental to growth. We have to increase our population. We have to grow more. We have to build more. That's the only way our planet can survive. And in order to do that, what we're doing is building things new and depriving and pulling from the earth and from our resources. The concept of donut economics, also called, which has a concept called circular economy, is to say that we need to rethink how we utilize our assets and how we survive. So, a real life concept for me in the way this applies is even immigration policy. Part of recent immigration policy has been impacted by the fact that we actually have a negative naturalized birth rate. So we are, as Canadians, we aren't growing our population. So all of our social services, employment insurance, Canada Pension Plan, all of these social security benefits, they are contingent on the workers of today supporting the workers of the past. And when the workers of the past are a far greater proportion of the population than the workers of today, the model breaks
Mhm.
because it's focused on a growth mindset. Instead, rethinking how all of our systems work and providing opportunities for those who are already receiving social security benefits to supplement their income, finding opportunities for them to participate in the economy, but to be productive and generate revenues. That grows the broader economy. It also helps the workers of today. So it's rethinking the way our economic systems. That's kind of the donut economics side of things. And I'm by no means an expert, but on the community capital side, it's just taking that and saying and looking at it from the same lens of understanding the limitations of what we can do economically, socially, and sustainably in terms of our environment, to not push those boundaries and instead to create more value with the things that we already have instead of just creating new things.
Well, and there's these mindsets that I think work against us. A lot of them are unconscious, and one is that growth requires being bigger and better. Well, what about if growth just required better, but not bigger? What would that be like? And you have all these other social dynamics. Like if the group that we're serving gets smaller, then am I going to be out of a job? So, oh, I might be. So maybe I better get more people to serve, even though they don't really need it. To keep that self interest, which is understandable. We have to eat. We have mortgages and things like that. But that whole cycle can be heading totally in the wrong direction and for the wrong reasons.
And these are the types of conversations I'm having with my clients at the municipal level and nonprofit level to say, you've been so focused on efficiency. You want to be hyper efficient. But if you're really efficient delivering a service that doesn't matter, that doesn't actually impact someone's life, it is not effective. So let's talk about effective services where we're actually serving people really, really efficiently but in a manner that actually advances and supports their livelihoods and their lives.
Yeah, I mean, the one of the issues that I keep struggling with is, how self-interest comes in so quickly. So it's great when it's an intellectual concept. I remember working with a group in an industry that I won't name, but they were all talking about how things got balanced out. What's fair and equal. And it was great when that was an intellectual conversation, but then when it came down to, so you mean I would end up getting paid less than all of a sudden
Sure.
all these great concepts went out the window, and self-interest rears. I won't say it's ugly head. It's always there, but how you balance between self-interest and other interest, and sometimes by demonstrating how, in some cases, that other interest is actually in our self-interest as well. I know it's all very theoretical, but so much easier said than done.
It is, but you're bringing in some elements of the human condition that I've been fascinated with over the past, I don't know, 5 or 6 years, and it was all born out of reading Daniel Kahneman's "Thinking Fast and Slow," where
Mhm.
it really breaks down all those traps that we have um, in the way we think, our biases, um, and the lenses that we assume. And then on the flip side, how others reframe our environment to make us think that we're gaining an advantage, that it's whatever situation is helpful to us, when in reality it may actually be detrimental to our long-term being. So you're right. There's the human aspect. We're very selfish in many ways and focus on ourselves, and to some degree, rightly so. But what we don't always appreciate is the influence of our environment in persuading us to think that we're engaging in behaviors that are advantageous for us, when in reality, it's sometimes questionable.
So just to maybe bring this home for our listeners, if you had an opportunity to provide some advice or tips to two different groups of people, and one is are groups that have been invited to participate in something, and let's just take that one rather than make this too complex. So, what advice would you give to someone who's been invited to participate in some sort of community engagement around, I think, a term you used in an earlier conversation, with some of these intractable issues where there's no easy answers. So, you've just been invited to do that. What's a mindset to go into that with if you were able to provide some advice along those lines?
So I'm going to borrow psychologist Adam Grant's term, uh, and really, it's actually about being humble about what you know. So there's one. Sorry to get long-winded here, but there's this one statement that always sits with me. It's being hard-headed about the facts, skeptical of slick answers and magic bullets, modest about what you know and understand, and perhaps more importantly, willing to try ideas and solutions that might be wrong, as long as it moves us towards the ultimate goal of building a more humane world.
That's beautiful.
And it totally resonates with me. It's don't take your feelings and your thoughts as assumed, um, as assumptions. They are, you know, you might be wrong. Be completely open-minded. And it's hard to think again, especially when you've heard so much rhetoric about a specific issue. But be open-minded, listen, ask questions, engage fully. If someone's asking for your opinion and your thoughts, give it wholeheartedly, but receive in equal measure. Receive the information from others. That's part of the duty in my mind to public participation. For many years, I ran the budget process at a local government, and having a conversation with someone about the implication of their tax increase. And all I was getting was the frustration and the vitriol. But the moment I had to explain what they were seeing, what they were going to receive, how it all came together, that level of understanding dissipated that frustration. Were they still unhappy that they had to pay more money? Of course.
Yep.
But there was a bit of understanding and and compassion for those who would actually be served the most. by those services.
Yeah, I think we want things to make sense for sure. I think part of it is creating an environment where someone comes in. No one's going to be able to see this on the screen, but my hand is closed. So this is what I come into the conversation with. This is what I know, and I hang on to it tightly. And just to set up the meeting as like you to just accept, just act as if there's the possibility that what you know may not be so, and just hold it a little more lightly, and to have that as kind of a frame for a conversation. Okay, here's the last question I'll ask you, then I'll let you go. And this for people that are thinking they might want to engage a community, however you define community, but common interest of some sort in a conversation. So when you're thinking about setting something like that or organizing it, what are some, please take these things into consideration as you enter into this project or process?
So think about the
Besides
physical.
hiring Dan as a consultant.
Oh,
Sorry, should
yeah,
have
of,
should have
of
framed it
course.
with that. Yeah.
No, the biggest thing is think about your physical environment as much as the social and psychological environment. Uh, I've walked into some engagements where there was so much focus on, just getting people together. That was the right thing to do. But the environment was set up that it created fracture. It
Huh.
was it just there was the room was too small. Everyone's crowded together. That builds tension. But then there's also this element of being mindful that there's people who don't want to engage.
Mhm.
And so what is their space in that environment? What are the mechanisms? How can you still hear from them? Because we know that introverts have great ideas. We just need to give them an avenue to bring them out into the open and to share them. So how are you engaging with the people who aren't willing to speak up in those moments? And then also, what's your commitment to circling back? What are you committing out of the process? You talked about trust, David. That is the foundation for all of this. We're seeing mistrust and distrust as a pervasive element of all of our interactions. How are you going to build trust in the process so someone's going to come back next time and trust that the information they're giving you is going to be honored? It doesn't have to be that you're going to activate on every single comment, but
Mhm.
how are you going to honor and acknowledge those
Yeah.
comments? Because that's what builds trust.
Just make sure people have an opportunity to be heard. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Dan, this has been great. Like, I love the nature of the work that you do. I think it's quite exciting, and it's so necessary. And to go into that kind of work, helping everyone keep their eyes open rather than their eyes closed. But thank you so much for being a guest today. I've really appreciated your time.
Thanks for giving me the time. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
And Dan, we'll put some notes, different references into the program notes if people want to go back and look at some of the things like that Adam Grant quote, for example,
Sure.
was fabulous. And so with that, I'll just say this has been another episode of Discover Fresh Perspectives, today with Dan Olivieri. And come back next week. All I can guarantee is it'll be a different person and a different conversation. Thanks so much. Subscribe now, because on Fresh Perspectives, every episode is an opportunity to explore new horizons and redefine what's achievable.